One of the areas that I'm constantly trying to challenge myself in is how to coach the already talented. Now, part of Jesuit formation, to give you a little context, is we tend to spend 3 years studying philosophy, hated it, 3 years of studying theology, I enjoyed it, but we also get to spend in between those two things 3 years of being in an apostolic work, teaching or coaching, and being present to people, and I absolutely loved it. And one of the favorite things I got to do was coach kids in football. And the truth is, I've had the pleasure of coaching a couple of kids who've gone on to play Division I football, and one might even be drafted in the next year's draft. I want to assure you that this has nothing to do with my ability as a coach. I did not coach them to Division I status. These kids came to the high school incredibly talented. One such young man was already very fast, faster than I could ever run. There's no way I was going to teach him to be faster. Another young man was just incredibly agile, and in fact, I had the briefest amount of hubris and tried to challenge him to a basketball game. I soundly lost. I wasn't very good to begin to play basketball to begin with, but this man's ability to move on the court or on the field was really something to behold. But that doesn't mean that they didn't need to be coached. And in a lot of ways, I think sometimes when I get up here to preach, that's the same feeling I have. I'm coaching an already talented group of people. I mean, our community has a lot going for it. We are incredibly welcoming, at least, not just that I think so, but we've heard time and time again, as we go to people, one of the greatest gifts of this community is welcoming people. Whether that's Father Warren and I walking around before Mass, if Father RJ isn't running behind on something, trying to welcome people to the liturgy, or greeting people, hopefully in a safe way and distance way now, but even before the pandemic, greeting people after Mass, and just being genuine. One of Father Warren's sort of inventions before the pandemic was having people stand at the end of the liturgy and introduce themselves to someone they didn't know. The idea of being welcoming and being a community that is going to receive and engage people wherever you happen to be is a true goal of this community, one that we always are looking forward to being better at. And that's part of the challenge, right? If you're an already talented community, how do you coach them? But I think taking a look at both today's readings and the sense of a talented athlete are two ways to help us grow in being an even better community. And the first is this. Good athletes have bad habits. Now, I won't say that any one of us in particular has a bad habit, but I'm sure there are ways in which we can become comfortable in our own routines. We show up at the time that we always show up in. We sit in the spot that we always sit in. We always sort of do routine in a particular way because as human beings, it's kind of natural to get to that default position. Great athletes will overcome a lot of their mistakes because of their talent. But even though they are talented, it's good to sort of remind them of sort of what their bad habits might be. On the field, that's kind of keeping your hands up, or maybe it's kind of keeping your vision up, or whatever that happens to be. You might be talented enough to overcome a mistake and outrun the player, but truly it's those fundamentals that will help you excel and become an elite player. All of us in the community, I think, also have those moments in which we just recognize that even though we are incredibly talented, there might be bad habits that can be coached out of us. And today's readings give us such coaching. Do we produce fruit? Do we really sort of do what the first letter to St. John is inviting us into? To truly believe in Christ and in the whole deed and truth. Not just by what we say, but do we actually live that in every fiber of where we're going today, tomorrow, and those time between those moments when we are privileged to sit in these pews? Are we actively engaging the world? Bringing about justice by being actively anti-racist, by inviting the other, by reminding ourselves of that desire and that call to truly love as Christ has invited us to love. We might be talented with our gregariousness, but are there bad habits that have creeped in? And that first letter to St. John reminds us that we might need to check on those. The second attribute, or the second way to coach an already talented kid, is that talented kids are, by their very nature, coachable. That is, that they're able to give and receive feedback almost as though it was second nature to them. That they know that they're talented, but truly talented kids are able to recognize that there's always something more they can be doing. There's that invitation to grow, that invitation to seek out adversity in some ways by asking someone, what might I be doing wrong? There isn't a more vulnerable position in this world, I think, than opening ourselves up to genuine feedback. Sometimes I'm afraid of that. To hear from other people like, oh, well, Father, this was good, but this could have been better, opens myself up into a position that I'm not always ready to hear. And so being coachable is an essential component of being a good community. And Paul hears that in the first reading from Acts today. That being coachable sometimes means that you have to deal with the community as it is. We hear in this little pericope from Acts that Paul isn't immediately received by the disciples. In fact, they're still terrified of him. They don't believe that he's actually had this amazing conversion moment. It requires another member of the community to vouch for Paul, who's at this moment in the Acts of the Apostles not even called Paul. He's still referred to as Saul, this sort of old hat that still holds on to him like a bad penny, still turning up here and there. He has to remain open to the idea that he can be coached, that he can be trained. And in fact, they don't send him out to be the great apostle that we know Paul to be. They send him to Tarsus. They send him somewhere else to continue to grow in his identity as this apostle. You know, I think this idea of conversion is one that we can sometimes get wrong, as though the moment happens and boom, I'm immediately converted. I've immediately got what I need. But Paul actually gives us a much more detailed journey of what that conversion really means. And I think this is a great invitation for our community. Can we be coachable? That even though we've had our conversion moments, those moments where we've said yes to this community and to this place, that we continue to grow and continue to be loved and continue to be able to see where it is that we want to be better. The third portion of that, though, is to know our limitations. Now, these might seem sort of counterintuitive between, this willingness to grow, but also knowing our limitations. We can't grow sort of infinitely. The one young man who was incredibly agile and faster than me on the basketball court and on the field was never going to be an offensive lineman. His body size it wasn't in his ability. He had to recognize his talents, and fortunately for his teams, his talent was being fast and agile. But knowing our limits is equally as important as knowing our ability to receive and give feedback. And this, I think, is the genius of the vine metaphor we receive from the Gospel of John. This vine metaphor says that we play a part in the grand whole, but we are not all of it. That as a plant can't have too many of one thing, that it needs to be pruned, that it needs to grow, our role is not to be the branch, but to be part of the vine. Jesus calls himself the vine in which we all participate, and not the actual stump of it, but actually those things that go out and produce fruit. If I get my terminology wrong here, it's because I've never grown grapes in my life. I've enjoyed quite a few, but I have no idea how to grow them. But the reality is that we recognize where we are and what we're invited to participate in and where we can't. Now, that can kind of be counterintuitive because there may be an invitation to grow and desire to say, I want to be able to provide this kind of role. And even on a football team, somebody who runs well and is quite agile might have to block from time to time. And thus, we kind of go back to that ability to be coachable, that ability to recognize how we participate in that whole. And perhaps the most important portion of all this is the idea of progress and not perfection. We will never be a perfect community this side of heaven, but we can always walk and grow in progress. We can always desire to grow in that progress, reaching out to more people, inviting more people here at Mass, and inviting more people into this community so that we can share this great news, this great community, and this great love that we have for one another and with the world. But all of this presupposes one central and core idea that community is necessary. Now, this being an already well-talented community, I don't think I need to stress this too hard, but it is nice to revisit it from moment to moment, that community, my friends, is necessary. Time and again, Father Warren and I have said that this liturgy would be nothing, and even in the early days of the pandemic, it was incredibly difficult when nobody was here. Preaching to an empty room is not as fun as it sounds, and trust me, it's even more difficult when you feel like you're not able to connect with those people whom you love and have grown to rely upon in so many ways. Community is essential not just for the celebration of the liturgy, but it is also necessary for the sacraments to have their efficacy in their fullness. I'm not saying that the sacraments are not effective without people. The sacraments are a gift from God. They are a way in which we see the divinity of God at work in the world. But their fullness, the fullness of the sacrament, is because the community participates in them. The community has this dynamic interaction. The community gives credence to the fact that these sacraments are powerful, and they receive the effects of the sacraments in their full power. And so how do we coach the already talented? As I've said before, we watch out for our bad habits, the ways in which we think we're incredibly welcoming, but we forget to welcome someone someday. We are aware of our bad habits, and sometimes of just being okay of where I'm at, and not striving to grow bigger, to grow more, and to grow deeper in this love. Thus, we remain coachable, we know our limitations, and we recognize that this is progress and not perfection.